It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. President Trump stops American military aid to Ukraine. Should Keir Starmer change his approach?
He's laser focused on getting peace. He won't be derailed by announcements. He will continue that dialogue with our oldest and strongest ally, the US.
Meanwhile, speaking to Fox News, the American Vice President says this.
The very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That is a way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years.
We'll be getting the latest reaction to all of that. Also today, nearly 600 people crossed the Channel in small boats in a single day. Is the government's plan working? And should Elon Musk be expelled from the world's oldest scientific academy? Joining us today, Labour MP Natalie Fleet, Conservative MP Luke Evans, journalist and broadcaster Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, and non-affiliated peer Claire Fox. This is Politics Live. Welcome. Dramatic developments overnight. Let's just show you this headline in BBC News. The US pausing Ukraine military aid, says the White House, and reports that could plunge the nation, Ukraine that is, into the deepest crisis it has faced since the war began. You'll remember yesterday that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, came to the House of Commons and delivered a statement on Ukraine, taking questions from MPs, including this one from the SNP leader in Westminster, Stephen Flynn.
Unfortunately, this afternoon it's been reported that President Trump is set to meet with American aides to discuss withdrawing military aid to Ukraine. Are these reports something that the Prime Minister recognises? And if so, what impact will that have upon the timetable he and President Macron are currently working to?
I haven't seen reports of the US withdrawing support for Ukraine, and as I understand, that is not their position.
But as we know, literally 24 hours later, they did pause that military aid, as we have just heard. My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Natalie, is has Keir Starmer been duped by Donald Trump?
You saw the meeting last week. He absolutely hasn't. Instead, we've got a really strong relationship, as strong as it always has been. Our defence, our military capacity is completely intertwined. He is... Things went really well last week, and it will protect people in constituencies like mine, because it means that we're going to get a trade deal, which should be fantastic. And then he's also done some incredible work making sure that Ukraine know that they are as supported as they physically can be, not just by us, but by our allies over the weekend. Right, but is Donald Trump still a trusted ally to Keir Starmer when, having pledged his support, the Prime Minister here, Donald Trump has withdrawn or paused military aid to Ukraine? There are going to be so many twists and turns along this journey. This isn't the last thing. This is the most recent thing that we've heard today. There will be lots more happening. We've seen what's happening in public, and there is lots happening behind the scenes. But what is really important here is that we will be working as strongly and as closely as we possibly can with the US to make sure that we get peace in Ukraine. I mean, there was broad support in the House of Commons from many of your colleagues, in fact, the majority of them, Luke. But what does it look like now? Do you think that support is now looking as if it's ebbing away privately, and that the Prime Minister comes across as naive?
Fair play to the Prime Minister. He went out there. Judging from where the Prime Minister was, the expectation level was quite low and he performed well. What he has done well is managed to galvanise the Europeans and pull them together. What he hasn't done is what he set out to do, which was secure the US, particularly for NATO, and what that looks like. That was my question that I posed him before he went, to say, what happens if you can't get the US to come with us? My worry is the US has been, the giant awake for the last 80 years, and now it's gone back to sleep. And we don't know for how long and what that means for the world, to be honest. And that's the question now we're asking. This is, Keir Starmer has jumped the first furlong in the Grand National, but there's many more fences to get over. And I wish him all the best. He'll have his support where we can constructively help him get there.
Is this bridging approach working that Keir Starmer has set out, this bridge between the US president and European nations?
I mean, on one hand, you can say no, because obviously he's not been in the loop in respect to the US withdrawing aid. On the other hand, I think Keir Starmer is trying to make the most out of the position that he's found himself in, not in the EU, but obviously there's that close relationship with the US. But unfortunately, Trump is inherently unpredictable. This is one of the things that foreign policy experts kept saying to me when Trump won, just before Trump won, and in the aftermath, and since he's come into office, is that he doesn't do politics in the kind of orthodox way. So you don't know what to expect. So all of the kind of the preparation that Starmer's probably had in his political career so far isn't necessarily going to work with Trump. A new approach is needed, and I think he's just trying to find his feet onto how to navigate through this situation with Ukraine.
And as a result of that, can he be trusted? Is he a trusted partner, Donald Trump?
I think we can safely say that he's not trustworthy in a straightforward way, because he can say anything. I agree with that. But I do think there's a deeper level. The old global world order associated with post-Second World War is gone. Right? I think we can know that, and I think that there's a danger of trying to wish it back into existence. And that's not just because of Donald Trump. We've seen signs of it for a long time, weakening international and globalist institutions. And I think what is unclear is what's going to emerge in its wake. Whether Keir Starmer can be now a part of this new world order is, I think, a question mark, because one of the things that makes me very nervous is that even though it was hugely impressive seeing that gathering at the weekend with the world leaders, actually there's a danger of it being bluster. What can they actually promise? I mean, I get stirred by the words, right? But then I'm thinking, we've barely got a navy. Never mind, you know what I mean? We're kind of 2.5% in a few years. I'm not particularly trying to have a go at Starmer. I'm asking a question about whether there is a danger that our rhetorical commitment is realisable, and therefore whether we maybe can't be trusted. Because if Ukraine actually thinks that we're going to go in and save them, that's not going to happen.
The European leaders tweet out, and it's very great putting a tweet, but at the end of the day, you've got to ask some of those countries to step forward, and the world has shifted, regardless of whether we like that or not. Yeah. Somehow, Europe has to stand up, and I put the UK in that, to say, well, where do we draw the line? But we need the US security guarantee to back it up, because we don't collectively, as Europe, have that ability to do it ourselves.
And also, a lot of our existing security and defence infrastructure, weaponry, intelligence is already inherently linked with the US. So that if that's going to be a kind of a divergence now, that in itself is an issue that needs to be discussed. So there's a lot to unpack.
Well, let's get some reaction from the chief political correspondent at the BBC, Henry Zeffman. Henry, Keir Starmer did get a lot of support broadly across the House yesterday for his stance, for his bridging approach, the sort of twin-track approach between the US and Europe. Is that holding firm?
Yes, it is, I think, for now, Joe. As you say, very broad support in the House of Commons and across political parties for Keir Starmer's approach. I think over the coming days and weeks, as things move at dizzying speed, we're going to learn how deep that support for Keir Starmer's approach is. I mean, you played, and I think it's very important at the start of your discussion with the panel there, that exchange between Stephen Flynn of the Scottish National Party and Keir Starmer, where Keir Starmer clearly showed that he did not know this was coming, this announcement from the US. Now, that is a bit of an indignity for the Prime Minister. I think his view will be that any number of indignities like that will be worth it if this approach of being a bridge between Ukraine and the US pays off. But actually, if they are a sign that one side of that bridge, the US, is not playing straight with him, then I think you'll see the Prime Minister come under a lot more pressure in time over this approach.
You used the word indignity. The Vice President, J.D. Vance, spoke to Fox News yesterday, where he made some comments that have caused some offence. Let's have a listen, first of all, to what he said.
If you want real security guarantees, if you want to actually ensure that Vladimir Putin does not invade Ukraine again, the very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That is a way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. The security guarantee and also the economic guarantee for Ukraine is to rebuild the country.
What's been the reaction to that so far at Westminster?
Well, really striking, vociferous reaction, especially from Conservative MPs who perhaps feel more licensed to speak out, given they're not part of the governing party. We've heard from James Cartledge, who's the Shadow Defence Secretary, saying NATO Article 5, which is where one NATO member must come to the defence of all, says has been invoked just once, the day after 9/11 by America. He says Britain and France came to their aid, deploying thousands of personnel to Afghanistan, including my own brother and numerous parliamentary colleagues. And he went on to accuse JD Vance of being deeply disrespectful. Similar from Ben Obisi-Jekti, another Conservative MP, says I was part of British forces fighting in highly kinetic operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The disrespect shown by the new US Vice President to the sacrifices of our service personnel is unacceptable. Now, worth noting, Joe, just in the last few moments, we've had JD Vance seeking to clarify what he said. He said the suggestion that he was talking about the UK and France is, in his words, absurdly dishonest. I don't even mention the UK or France in the clip, he says, both of whom have fought bravely alongside the US over the last 20 years and beyond. But let's be direct, there are many countries who are volunteering support who have neither the battlefield experience nor the military equipment to do anything meaningful. I think that clarification will probably take a bit of the heat out of this, stop it from escalating into a real diplomatic spat which would require the government to step in. But I have to say, given only the UK and France have publicly committed the possibility of troops to Ukraine, it is hard to see who else JD Vance was referring to.
Well, we're hoping to speak to Ben Obisi-Jekti later on in the programme following his remarks in that tweet. Henry Zeffman, thank you very much. But picking up from that, are you offended by what JD Vance said?
After what we saw on Friday, I actually raised it in the Parliament yesterday, there's a difference between decent and deceit is one letter, but actually the gap is the true measure of someone's character. And I think we need to have some decency in the way in which we treat each other. My worry is that we're living through social media where everything goes on social media. We have to be able to say hurty words. We have to be able to have frank conversations. Whether it's right to do it in the public interest, I'm pleased JD Vance clarified his position. And yes, people will be offended. They rightfully fought, we fought alongside the Americans on that basis. But we need calm heads and take the heat out of some of this argument rather than getting the tit for tat, because quite literally the word security is at stake here.
Right, but random countries that haven't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. I'd like to know which countries he was actually talking about there, Natalie. I mean, do you understand why these Conservative MPs are upset?
I understand the sacrifice that our troops made, their families made, their children made. We were there, we were allies of the US, and that was absolutely the right thing to do, and I'm thrilled that we've got the clarification. Right.
Do you think that's enough of a clarification, Claire?
Well, I am worried, as Luke says, if we start behaving as though we're easily offended by something that somebody said and overreact. I think that is a danger, because I think the thin-skinned nature of the Trump regime and the way that JD Vance behaved, being thin-skinned, I don't want to imitate that. I also think it's worth... So, if it's a clarification, fine. I'm sure that it was misspoken, completely wrong. But it's a reminder, by the way, of Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, before we all say Afghanistan are brave troops, that's fine. Can we also remember what a debacle Afghanistan and Iraq were, right? And the reason I'm saying that is because we're now talking about military interventions. We're talking about gathering troops together. We won't necessarily have the backup of the US, it seems. I think that any Labour leader has to remember Iraq. We have to remember that Afghanistan was less than glorious. The sacrifices of those troops were actually very contentious. The Iraq war was not one, I'm going to say...
But what's your comparison then in terms of Ukraine? I mean, you've said because we don't have enough troops, perhaps, to make those commitments in the first place. But are you actually saying we shouldn't actually do it?
No, actually, the very opposite of that. I think that the way to go, if there is a way to go, is to support Iraq. To support Ukraine in its self-defence. It's they that have fought this war so brilliant. I mean, God, with ingenuity, courage in a way that none of us could imagine. And they need to be given a way of seeing through the defence of their own sovereignty. Now, the reason I'm emphasising that is because I don't think... I'm worried about the kind of troops on the ground being a posture and not necessarily a helpful one. But in order to get the support that we need to give Ukraine, we are going to also have a conversation with the UK public. And I don't think that's given.
Well, that conversation has started to some extent because, of course, they've talked about sort of generating, rearming broadly, jobs being created.
The importance of sovereignty has been at least a row in this country for some time. As somebody who argued for sovereignty and borders, it wasn't always something that you were congratulated for. You were kind of dismissed as being some kind of lunatic. Right?
Well, Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the opposition Conservatives, has said this. The news overnight that America is halting military aid to Ukraine is profoundly worrying. It is clear that Britain and Europe must rearm much faster if we want to provide Ukraine with more than just warm words of support. We must work to keep America in and Russia out. What do you make of those remarks? To rearm even more quickly than is being suggested?
Yeah, so just to quickly touch on Vance's comments, I would say it's not just about being thin-skinned. I think it's the message it sends to Russia, to anybody who is considering being hostile to the UK or to Europe. If the US and the UK are kind of talking about each other in this way, as your correspondent pointed out, it's hard to know who else Vance was talking about, given only the UK and France have said they'd commit troops. But when it comes to spending on GDP in terms of defence, I think it's an inevitability we're going to have to increase defence spending.
Well, over and above even the 2.5%.
I think so. I think particularly given now, a lot of Europe and the UK, we've ridden on America's coattails when it comes to defence. I don't think it's a secret, and I think Trump has tapped into that because he is a populist and he's aware that there is this feeling in America of being sick of being involved in all these wars, sick of spending all this money on defence. And the US's defence budget, I advise people watching at home to go and Google it. It's crazy. It's something that has been supporting us in not spending the money that we should be spending. So as the world order changes and as we need to stand more alone because we can't rely on the US because Trump is doing politics in a different way, we will have to spend more on defence. It's inevitable.
Right, but I mean, Kemi Badenoch's talking about 3%, Luke Evans. She also said in an interview with the BBC on Sunday that they talked about that, they discussed it, and they couldn't make the numbers work.
So, well, her tweet was a statement of fact from there. Keir's government cut the FCDO budget, which I do support. When I was a defence PPS with the last government...
Foreign, Commonwealth and Defence,
absolutely. When I was a PPS, we had a plan in the defence brought forward at the end of April to say how we could fund this with civil servant cuts. Now, the new government is going to have to look at how it can potentially do this. Right. That is the reality of the world we're looking at.
The sums don't add up. Cutting civil service jobs will not get us to 3% of GDP on defence spending.
Well, it would have done with the 2.5, but you've now heard exactly we've cut the defence, the aid budget, to try and add up. So we have said we're quite happy to see what the government brings forward. We've had their budget, which is change the direction of the country, to put it politely. We're going to have to see where Rachel Reeves comes. If I was her, I'd do an emergency budget. It allows her to solve the problems of all the difficulties she's had.
Well, she may well.
Well, she's going to need
she may well. Yeah. Well, she'll
to solve this defence problem, and also it covers up the tracks of her mishandled budget that we've seen.
Right. How will it be paid for? To go even from 2.5%, which the government is now committed to, by 2027. Yes, it's going to be made up, Luke is right, by cuts that have been made unpopular in many parts of the Labour Party to the international aid budget. But to go even further, if you think that is right, to go to 3%, where would it come from, the money?
So the defence budget now is the highest since the Gulf War. We had Conservatives that left defence hollowed and underfunded. I think it was Ben Wallace that said that. It was in a mess. We have had to find this money and we've had to make the most difficult decisions. I mean, that budget shouldn't have had to have been cut in the way that it has, but it's the right thing to do. It's what constituents of mine absolutely wanted us to do. When there is not much money, we have to prioritise keeping ourselves safe. I'm glad that we've done it. We've said that we'll look at moving further in the next Parliament.
So what are you looking at?
And be obsessed. We have delivered. We've gone up to 2.5%, which you had a plan for. It wasn't a very good or credible plan, and it never actually happened. So now you're saying you would go to 3%. You're not saying how you would. And in fact, Kemi is saying that it couldn't happen.
We're happy to. You're the
We're
government.
not saying 3%. And we're not saying how. We're saying we have got to.
Exactly.
We've got to 2.5%, something you did not achieve.
Well, the government is saying to move to 3%, but not until the end of the next Parliament. But where would that money come from? I mean, would you support welfare cuts?
I support defence spending so that we are safe and that we can have peace in Ukraine. And Rachel Reeves, the first woman Chancellor, is very good at making sure that the money comes from the right places.
Right. In well, I mean, that is a discussion that's yet to be had, clearly, if it is going to move to 3%, because we are talking about several billions more. I mean, let's have a look at this headline. BBC News: US tariffs on China, Mexico and Canada kick in. This was the early threat made by Donald Trump, and it's happening 25% to Mexico and Canada and 10% on China. Again, can the US and can Donald Trump be trusted as a partner and an ally to find peace in Ukraine when he has just levelled these tariffs against an ally, Canada, which is an ally? Can we trust him?
I think we're going to have to try and solve it out. But was it Reagan who said, trust but verify? And I think that's really, really important here. I think from Trump's perspective, and I may be wrong, but he's always campaigned on make America great again. He wants to see no wars, and he wants to see the defence spending of NATO increase to basically countries pay their way for it. He's bludgeoning his way to do that. Whether we like it or not, that's what's happening. The problem, what he's missing, is the diplomacy and the reaction of doing that. He's treating it as a business deal, but we have to live and work in a world around it. And all these fractious natures we see about tweets and comments and things being read into it is really the problem, because it shows how unnerved everyone is. Rightfully so. It's how we get that back to actually answer that. So in answer to your question about those tariffs, it is a worry, but he telegraphed that from a long way. It's trying to understand what he really wants out of it. That's the key thing, to play a line to it. So he liked it when Keir Starmer went there and offered him to see the royal family, because he knows, in his own words, he holds all the cards. So it's how we negotiate that and hopefully use our position in between Europe and America to try and alleviate that and make him see that actually it's in America's best interest to work with us.
Right, well, I mean...
The Prime Minister's doing a great job.
Well, underlining that, though, we've just had an update on what the Prime Minister has said to the Cabinet today. And it's been revealed he spoke to President Trump twice over the weekend and again last night, but clearly not told about what the Americans were about to do in terms of pausing that aid to Ukraine. What does that say about the uneven level of that relationship with the US president?
If we had tariffs here to the same level that we've seen in countries like Canada, then my constituents in Bolsover would suffer. So the fact that Keir Starmer is going over and charming Trump, and we're going to have a state visit, and Trump is then saying that we are going to have a trade deal. This is all really positive news for us.
Right, all positive, just briefly, and then we've got to move on. Claire?
I do think that the tariff situation with Canada and Mexico and so on could backfire on America. The American economy is not as solid. However, we have to concentrate on our own economy. And one of the things that I think we're not talking about is how we reindustrialise. I do think when you're saying about the money, I know that you won't be surprised when I say, can we look at net zero again? Because reindustrialising and what we're spending our money and the need for cheap energy, a UK steel industry, and so on and so forth, are now more important. But also, rearming is not just technical. It has to be a conversation. And British patriotism has been introduced and impugned by UK politicians over recent years. National sovereignty is not something that's been celebrated. The history of the UK has been, we're told, mad in imperial and colonial sins and so on. And the reason I'm saying that is because if you're going to actually mobilise people to support paying money for rearmament, you have to have a sense of why. What are we doing it for?
What do you think
people fighting those on-the-ground troops and so on? And I'm not convinced that argument has been won even amongst our own ruling elites.
Do you think those arguments need to be articulated to the public before there are any moves on peacekeeping troops or otherwise?
I think you're starting to get into more ideological perspectives as opposed to, for example, I'm quite able to be quite proud to be British and also be quite honest about the country's colonial and imperial past, and I don't find them. But I don't find them in contrast. So I think that's a completely a broad topic that can be explored. But yeah, I do think the argument and the justification for a greater defence spending needs to be articulated and people brought along with it, and not just dumped on people without an explanation as to why. Because British people are quite good at, recognising when you do need to just crack on with something. And if you kind of communicate it well, I think people will get it.
Let's talk to Ben Obsijekti, the Conservative MP, who tweeted in response to what the US Vice President said about random countries that we discussed earlier on. Hello to you, Ben. You might have heard the denials from the Vice President saying he wasn't talking about Britain and France. What's your response to that?
Well, I think the comments from the Vice President were badly misjudged, and I think he's done an awful lot of damage there. It's difficult to see who he was talking about if he wasn't talking about Britain and France. We're the only two countries that have really talked about putting any significant troops on the ground in Ukraine as part of peacekeeping efforts following any conflict. So I appreciate his need now to backpedal on those comments and walk them back, but it's clear that there was some mischief being made there in terms of those comments being, I would say, quite clearly aimed at Britain and France, particularly following the successful talks at the weekend with President Zelensky.
Right, we've just shown the tweets again where he says, people are being dishonest about what I meant. I didn't actually name Britain and France. But you said the disrespect shown by the new US Vice President to the sacrifices of our service personnel is unacceptable, and I'm sure you stand by that. What would you like to hear, perhaps from the Prime Minister or indeed Kemi Badenoch on this?
I don't really think it's for them to call out the Vice President any more than they potentially would do. I think he knows the damage that's been done, and it would be good for him to make good on that apology. We know that JD Vance is a former US Marine himself, so he knows well the sacrifices made by British and French forces, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, standing shoulder to shoulder alongside America, following the invocation of Article 5 in response to 9/11, and that's how we ended up in Afghanistan. That's how I ended up in Afghanistan. I served in Sangin. That was an area where the US Marines took significant casualties, as did we. And so I think it's crucial that President Vance clarifies his comments. If he wasn't talking about Britain and France, he might have been talking about some of our other NATO partners, particularly Denmark or Estonia, both of whom took per capita the same type of casualties that the US took on those operations. So I think he needs to come out and clarify those comments and make clear to everybody exactly who he stands behind and the value that he places on his allies.
Does it undermine what the Prime Minister here is trying to do in terms of collaborating and trying to find some sort of peace deal or work between the US and Ukraine when JD Vance comes out and says things like this?
I think it makes his job very difficult, and I think it causes some confusion as to exactly which position he's trying to negotiate with. I think we're very clear on what the Prime Minister wants to do with regards to any post-conflict peacekeeping forces and his stance in support of Ukraine. I think we're much less clear on exactly where the US stand on this, and particularly where the US stands in relation to Russia.
How much damage has been done? You say damage has been done. What exactly?
I think you can see from the responses from myself, from the Shadow Defence Secretary James Cartledge, there's been some real offence caused here, and I think it's something that will linger in the memory for a lot longer than the tweet.
Ben Obsijekti, thank you very much, joining us there from Central Lobby in the Houses of Parliament. Well, the Royal Society last night had what's been described as a crisis meeting by some over the issue of whether Elon Musk, the tech billionaire, and someone key to the administration of Donald Trump should be expelled from the organisation. Let's have a look at this headline from BBC News. Elon Musk sparks row at Royal Society but remains a member. There were attempts to strip him of the honour of being a member of the Royal Society, but it didn't actually happen in the end. Let's talk to Professor Stephen Curry, Emeritus Professor of Structural Biology at Imperial College London, who wrote a letter signed by 3,300 other scientists expressing deep concern about the billionaire's fellowship. Hello to you. What are your objections, Professor, to Elon Musk being part of the Royal Society?
Well, the objections outlined in the letter are that Elon Musk's statements and actions are in contravention of the code of conduct that the Royal Society has. And fellowship of the Royal Society is a great honour that's conferred on very few people, but that code of conduct makes it clear that the fellowship is predicated, it's a privilege that is predicated on adherence to particular standards of conduct, and that all those joining the society agree to abide by that code. So there are things that Mr. Musk has said and done that are apparently in contravention to that. And it's the fact that the Royal Society has, despite sort of months and months of concerns raised by many fellows within the organisation, it has chosen to do nothing and to say nothing in respect of that.
Right, and what's your reaction to that?
Well, I'm disappointed. I'm glad that they held a meeting of the fellows to discuss. I think I'm not sure exactly what the agenda of the meeting was. I don't know whether they discussed Elon Musk's fellowship, but I know that some fellows are certainly exercised on that point. But it was a more general discussion, I think, around how they should respond to behaviours of fellows who which are in apparent contravention of the Royal Society. They did issue a short statement in which they kind of reiterate their support for the need to stand up for science. They expressed some concern over the sort of cuts that are being imposed within America, and Mr. Musk is kind of deeply involved in implementing those cuts, which are causing enormous damage. And it's a bizarre situation that we have a fellow of the Royal Society, an organization that exists to promote science, but he's actually acting in a very opposite way.
Right.
And yet there was no comment made in the statement, and that's the paradox, I'm afraid, that still puzzles me.
Right. Well, Professor Curry, please stay with us because we have our guests in the studio. Claire, what is your response, just listening to that, in line with, let's take one example, the cuts that Professor Curry has outlined. This is him, Elon Musk, being DOGE, the department that he's set up in the States to get rid of government waste. And they are, it seems, at odds with the sort of rules and beliefs of the Royal Society. Shouldn't he go?
No. And I'm really pleased that the Royal Society is not given in to this kind of idea of ideological orthodoxy. The fellowship of the Royal Society is based on your scientific and technological ingenuity, and there's no doubt about it that Musk, in relation to space travel and electric vehicles and so on, that's what he got it for. Unless we're going to do an audit of every single member of the Royal Society and check their politics for correctness or to see whether they behaved according to the code, which would be rather McCarthy Act. And there's only been 2 people expelled in nearly 400 years, by the way, and that was for not paying fees and for fraud or something. There was a big campaign, by the way, to get rid of Marie Curie because she didn't live by the code. She had an affair with a married man, so I'm just pointing out.
All right, well, let me let Professor Curry come back on what
only one other thing to say is we're always trying to urge scientists to get involved in politics. As far as I know, we're always trying to say, why don't you get involved in... I can assure you, any scientist that is involved in any cabinet of any government at the moment will make cuts in terms of science funding. And you're going to expel them all, or, as I say, audit in a McCarthyite way.
Right.
Terrible.
Well, it's a McCarthyite. It's a sort of McCarthyite persecution of Elon Musk, Professor Curry.
No, I didn't say of Musk in particular.
No. Lots of words to Google.
Sorry,
here,
but I disagree profoundly with that view. This is nothing to do with ideological orthodoxy. This is about upholding a code which expresses the values that the scientific community shares very widely. These are values that are rooted in integrity, in respect for evidence and respect for the truth. And what we have here actually is a completely unprecedented situation. I mean, it may be the case that the Royal Society has not expelled anybody before, but that's not an argument for looking at the facts of this particular case. And it is an extraordinary case because there hasn't in history before been a fellow of the Royal Society who was really quite at the centre of a government administration and who was imposing draconian and immediate cuts, summary sackings of researchers and research support staff, some of which have been reversed because they realised they sacked the wrong people, some of which have been stayed because they are falling foul of the law of the land in the United States. And so this is an extraordinary situation. I agree with Claire that we don't want to be sort of scanning the social media feeds of every single fellow. I'm not advocating for that whatsoever, but there's clearly been some public statements and actions that have generated an awful lot of concern.
All right, well, let me
in contravention of the code which expresses the values. And why does the Royal Society have a code if it's not actually going to use it?
All right,
they haven't explained.
No, fair enough. Let me get Claire. Let me get Claire to respond, and then I want to get the views of the other panellists.
It is absolutely imperative that the Royal Society sticks with objective truth as the outcome for science. I agree with that completely. I think there are huge scientific scandals at the moment. For example, it is scientifically true that you cannot change sex. and that might be controversial, but it's scientifically true. There are lots of people who are involved in the senior regions of science who don't go along with that. There were scientists, senior scientists in this country, who clamped down on the information that the coronavirus likely started in the Wuhan lab. And they said, they actually sowed misinformation. So the reason I'm using those examples, they're contentious, I know, is that I do not feel that there is, as yet, sufficient adherence to science objectively researched and truth and so on across the board of every senior scientist or indeed fellow of the Royal Society, which is why it feels political.
Right. Well, as you say, those are contentious issues that you have raised.
Although it's not
there.
contentious
Now,
that you can't change
well, hang
text.
on, but they're contentious issues in terms of what the science may or may not say. I mean, if I just show you this tweet from Geoffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI, is also a fellow of the Royal Society, he said, "I think Elon Musk should be expelled from the British Royal Society, not because he peddles conspiracy theories and makes Nazi salutes, but because of the huge damage he is doing to scientific institutions in the US." Now let's see if he really believes in free speech. Nadine, what's your...
I think that societies are privileges. You know, if you're a member, it's a privilege. It's something you're given. It's not something you're entitled to. I think Elon Musk is entitled to behave however he wants to behave within the purview of the law. However, if the Royal Society as an organisation finds that its code of conduct has been broken or it's bringing their society into disrepute and they no longer want him as a member, that is by nature of being a society. There is a right to that. It's not just part of existing in society. Again, I think that Elon Musk should be able to say and do what he likes within the purview of the law. But if he's part of a group and they feel like he's bringing their organisation to disrepute or making them feel less trustworthy in people's eyes, and I understand why there are those that may want him to be removed. And if it is done by democratic processes within that organisation, then fair enough.
Should he be kicked out?
Can I come in? Sorry, I'm absolutely chomping at the bit. And the reason I am is because this is the kind of conversation that turns normal people off politics. When you knock on their door and they say, "Oh, it doesn't mean anything to me." I mean, there are words. I've had to Google what the Royal Society is. I don't know what McCarthyite is. What this comes down to is two things. One, we've got Elon Musk. He is part of a democratically elected government, and we can't just not
he's not elected to the government.
He's been chosen by the administration. Yeah. And we can't say that democracy only works when it elects people like me and people like you, and when it elects people we don't like or they bring them into government, we don't like it. So he's in the position he's in because of democracy. And the second fundamental point here is about disinformation. There's a real issue around disinformation and politics. As Donald Trump would say, fake news. That's endemic. And that's why it's so important that we've got governments like ours absolutely delivering around getting waiting lists down, around stopping small boat crossings, because that's the only way you combat fake news. You deliver as a government.
Just before I come to you, Luke, Professor Curry, do you want to answer the point, though, raised by Natalie, that this is the sort of thing that turns off normal people, this sort of discussion? It's not really about people's day-to-day lives, is it?
Well, I do have some sympathy with that view. I imagine most people in this country actually aren't aware of the Royal Society's existence, but it is an important body. It's our National Academy of Science, and it brings together the sort of very best scientists from around the UK. But they do have an important role. They liaise closely with government. They spend government money on research funding and grants to many individuals. And so they do have a public role, and they do have a public voice. It may not be heard, and I would like certainly that it is heard more. And I'm certainly keen on more scientists being involved in politics. But this is not undermining democracy, and this is not this is not attacking people because they belong to a particular government. My concerns are very much rooted in the fact that the Royal Society does not, has made a declaration of values in its code of conduct,
yes,
and is choosing not to apply it in this particular and extraordinary and unprecedented case.
Let me get a response from you, Luke.
I don't know, is the honest answer.
Well, that is honest.
Well, it seems slightly odd when we're talking about war in Europe, we've got the big farmers' protest outside, how this affects people's lives. I respect the professor for writing his letter and the fellows who want to get involved. My worry is this an overreach for government stepping in to be asked politicians debating these kind of topics over whether the society's broken rules or not? I'd rather see a place where we can have these disagreements, not the hurty tweets that we've just been talking about with JD Vance, because at the end of the day, we need to see the substance of what's going on. Actions going to have consequences, and the professor's asking for action from there, but it's right that society have that meeting, decide, are they a lobbyist organisation, what do they think about their free speech? I give them the right to be able to do so. So at the end of the day, I'm more interested in trying to sort out what I have control over, which is trying to hold the government to account in my role as a shadow minister, but also as a backbench MP for my constituents, my farmers, my
all right.
people
I do
with
think,
businesses.
by the way, that on the doorstep, the issues around cancel culture and free speech are quite alive, though. So they might not know about the specifics of the Royal Society, but I think that there's a very popular absolute irritation with people being cancelled for having the wrong politics.
All right.
And that's very
Professor Curry,
widespread.
thank you very much for joining us.
We're going to not cancel culture. This is about adhering to standards and standards of evidence and standards of truth.
Well, I would
hate really important, as Claire has said, in any political or science-based discussion.
Well, I hate to shut down any discussion and open debate, but I am going to on this one now. Professor Curry, thank you very much for joining us. I just want to show you this in the final minutes of the programme. BBC News headline: UK adds target Iraq to deter small boat crossings. We can show you a flavour of the social media campaign in Iraq from the UK government. We can see here, this says the Arabic there, people disappeared into the sea. Another ad that is going out saying, I was promised a well-paid job, instead I was a slave. And finally, I feared they would kill me if I escaped. It follows similar campaigns by previous Conservative governments in 2023 and 2024. Let's talk to Simon Jones, BBC reporter. He is in Calais. Talk to us about the latest numbers of people who have made that crossing.
Yeah, it's been a really busy couple of days out there in the Channel, with almost 800 people having reached the UK, and that brings the total so far this year to almost 3,000 people. Now, the numbers do, of course, fluctuate depending on the weather, depending on the supply of boat parts, but I think what will be worrying for the British government and the French government here too is that numbers so far this year are on the upward trajectory, about 12% higher than they were in the same period last year.
Right. Now, there have been calls from politicians, from mayors in northern France, for the Prime Minister to come over and understand the impact of the Channel crossings and the humanitarian crisis there. What have you been seeing?
Yeah, I've been speaking to the mayors and they say they want Sir Keir Starmer here himself. Now, I've spent quite a lot of time here over the past couple of weeks. One really noticeable thing is the number of police officers we're seeing out and about. We were on the beach earlier. There are police officers on patrol. We came across a boat that looked like it had been slashed by police officers to prevent a crossing. In the dunes, we see clothes discarded, people waiting there to try to get across to the UK. We've also seen camps, people living in absolute squalor. There's a former wine warehouse on the outskirts of Calais that now houses hundreds of people in tents. And I've been speaking to people who will say quite openly they only want to get to the UK, they don't want to be here. A man called Akam from Iran told me that he had attempted a crossing and almost it cost him his life.
Simon Jones.
It's very, dangerous. We thought we will die.
You thought you would die?
Yes, but after the French big boat come help us.
But you'll try again?
I don't know. I'm really scared.
There hasn't been a response, of course, from the government as yet. What will the mayors in that part of France continue to do?
Well, I think they'll continue to push for more British support to deal with what they think is a British problem, because they say the migrants want to get across the Channel, they don't want to be in France. Now, the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, did come to Calais last week, the first British Home Secretary to come here for around 5 years. She spoke to her French counterparts and some of the mayors, but the mayors say it's putting a huge pressure on the local community with hundreds of people sleeping rough. And the mayors also tell me they're having to deal with the situation where they get calls in the middle of the night from the authorities saying, prepare yourself, open up sports halls, because people are being rescued at sea and body bags are coming back to shore.
Simon Jones, thank you very much there from Calais. I mean, does it show that the government's plan is failing?
The government's plan is working. What we've had is 14 years of Conservative failure. They let gangs thrive. They stopped sending people back. There were no deportations. Now we have a government that we were elected in July, and the first thing that happens...
And the arrivals are up 20%.
...is the biggest ever. So we've had 19,000 deportations. We've had the most deportations in 6 years. We have a credible plan, and it is working. It's taking time. We've only been in post a matter of months, but we are seeing, if we want a real deterrent, we do not need £700 million spent on 4 volunteers going to Rwanda or £8 million a day spent on hotels. Instead, we're delivering around immigration.
It's all we have time for, but thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. Bye-bye.